Welcome to the Neural Implant Podcast, where we talk with the people behind the current events and breakthroughs in brain implants in an understandable way, helping bring together various fields involved in neuroprosthetics. Here is your host, Laden Yurachek.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Neural Implant Podcast. Today's guest is Nathan Piland, and he is the founder of Nunex, which is a neurotech or medtech consulting firm. They do medtech momentum multiplied, and so they look at the whole process of everything to do with medtech market access, funding, product development, quality, regulatory, clinical strategy, commercial communications, and commercialization. So 7D, 7 dimensions, as we were just talking about before we started recording. But Nathan, do you want to introduce yourself and introduce your company better than I just did?
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to just speak with you this morning. Absolutely. So Nathan Piland, as you said, founder and CEO of Nunex. And Nunex is a strategic consulting firm that empowers medtech ventures to arrive at their next destination faster and with greater confidence. We do that through our proprietary 7-dimensional approach, which happy to dive into that a little bit if you like to, Lennon. And that's how we deliver on our promise of building medtech momentum for the business.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, so yeah, let's hear a little bit about your story. I mean, you're the founder of Nunex, right? So how did you decide to get into medtech consulting? That's kind of a random thing, to send somebody off the street.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Well, it wasn't like it was necessarily planned. It, like a lot of things in life, it was a bit of a journey. And what I mean by that is I started off with the large strategics, the big name medical device companies. Started off at one point actually in manufacturing and engineering, then moved into class 3 implantable devices at some of the largest names that most of you would be familiar with in the aortic aneurysm space and the transcatheter heart valve space. It was a lot of fun. It played in the engineering part of me because I'm an engineer by background. But as I continued to mature through those roles, I found myself being placed in leadership positions and starting to lead teams. And at the same time, I was acquiring my master's of business from Babson College, one of the top entrepreneur schools in the country, most people know about. And so I started to find this bit of a niche where I was having fun within these large strategics and learning a lot, but I also was starting to have this itch to do things differently and started to become a little bit frustrated with what a lot of people would say is the kind of the natural, chug and slug of large strategic organizations, right? Of getting things done. And so that's actually what made me take an adjacent step out of the organization and into the consulting space. And it wasn't for myself at first. I stepped into some other smaller consulting organizations. And the purpose of doing that is because folks said, if you ever want to run your own business, you need to understand how sales is performed and business development is performed. And so, what do you mean? They're like, trust me, go out, do this, and you'll understand what I mean. And now sitting back here, I do understand what I mean. It's not like you're selling a bunch of pens, or cars or whatever you're selling. There is a difference between professional service sales and what you're selling to them. It's based on relationships. It's based on trust, credibility, and value, which is very different than previous companies and other types of companies when you're in sales. So that's what I learned as I stepped out of the large strategics and into some consulting organizations, and then eventually wanted to get back to what I call the tech space and really start partnering with startups and early stage organizations where there was a large need for certain kinds of capabilities and talents that I had, as well as my peers that I had been working with for the last 10, 15 years had. And that's where Nunex started to really get born, if you will, by starting to work with some of these companies and starting to build the business model and really play around with that business model to understand what's really working and not working, much like you would for a new tech, right? A new company, a new solution, as you launch it. Did the same thing here with the Nunex. And that's really how I arrived at where we're at. And we're doing great. I mean, absolutely love what I'm doing. It's a great blend of everything I've always, some of the things that I can add value and be good at. And the best part is that I get to work with a lot of my friends that I've worked with for the last 20 years, as well as get to work with a lot of really great founders and really great leaders in some of those earlier stage revenue generating companies.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. Yeah, it is it does seem like a better fit, but why did you choose to work with startups? Why not more the strategics? I mean, it does seem like that was your experience previously.
Absolutely. No, that's a good question. In the strategic space, it's a different set of needs and a different set of processes. And a lot of the times in the large strategics, things can get compartmentalized quite a bit. And I saw that when I was inside, and I even see it on the outside. I used to call into some of these strategics, the big names in the industry, and they're great to work with, but there's definitely some differences. And like I said, it's really around kind of placing you in a box and saying, okay, if you're a quality person, okay, I'm going to look at you just for quality management systems and quality risk analysis, and that's it. And in my background and the company's background, our skill set is not just within those individual boxes. Our skill set and differentiation is actually in the integrativeness of all of these pieces. And that's how the seven dimensions was born, Aladdin, was these seven dimensions I have seen and my partners have seen time and time again that strategic organizations have played with these levers in a very conscious, proactive way to ensure their success. And the companies that haven't have failed typically because they haven't managed these seven critical dimensions. And so whether we're working with an early stage startup and saying, hey, we need to really work through these things and plan these out and detail these out in order to be successful. When we work with revenue generating companies and they're struggling and we're asked to come in and take a look at what's going on and look at the root causes, it always comes back to at least one of those seven core dimensions.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, let's go over it. And is the seven dimensions, is it, I guess, sequential, or is it something that some things are more important later on in, I don't know, later stages of a startup company? And at what point should a company start, thinking about this, like if it from idea conception and we got a buddy together and let's go do something, or is it more kind of, like, oh, we already have revenue and products and, all this kind of stuff in place. So yeah, what's the sequence of this?
Sure. So the interesting part about it is that much like a risk analysis document is, if we really want to nerd out for a second, a DFMIA is a living document, risk files, right, within the design control process. These seven dimensions are never done, or at least they shouldn't be, in my opinion. These seven core dimensions are things that, yes, you should be doing them as early as possible, and I'll give you an example why. As well as your revenue generating company, you should be keeping a pulse on these as well and understanding how things are changing within your business that may make you want to rethink something. So I'll give you a couple of examples. So the earlier example is, let's say you have an idea. I had a founder say to me, you know, I understand what you do, but first I want to go build a prototype. And I said, okay, well, how much is that going to cost you? He's like, well, $75,000. I said, okay, how big's the market and can you get paid for it? He's like, well, we haven't done that yet. We want to build a prototype first. I said, okay, so what you're telling me is you're willing to liquidate your savings, spend whatever you're going to spend on building a really cool piece of tech, not knowing if you even have a market that you can get into from a regulatory perspective, a market that there's even a business model that you can get paid for and actually get your money back from the investment of just let alone the prototype. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Right. And that's the kind of thing that we run into. And so, to your question, when should you start? You should start as early as that. And my thing would be, hey, instead of taking, let's make these numbers up, $50,000 and put it on your tech to develop it, take 10% of that and put it on, looking at the market, looking at some of these other aspects. Because maybe you don't want to spend the extra 40 on building something that's just going to sit on your desk and collect dust. So, so it's the early stage stuff. And then the later stage, organizations that are generating revenue, those things are still applicable. So the seven core dimensions are market access, pricing, reimbursement. So there's a product market fit in a bucket. There's at the C-suite and funding support, okay? And those are all about the financial models, investor strategies, and narratives. The regulatory strategy as well. How are you getting through the FDA or EU, EU, MDR, European Union, etc. Product development around the design controls, the risk management of that, quality management systems, your clinical strategy and execution. And then last but not least, the seventh dimension is your strategic communications and commercialization. So this is all around how do you go to market, how do you drive sales, and really how do you get into those target accounts. And so hopefully you can see there that the later stage companies, their regulatory might be kind of locked and loaded, maybe, because they've got clearance, etc. Their product development may be mostly locked and loaded because obviously they got clearance and it's gone through the V&V process and they're good. But how do you take feedback from the market to know what future products or changes you need to make to your, fifth dimension product development? And how do you get that feedback in the market? Well, that's your market access, product market fit bucket. So what are you doing there in order to continuously get that feedback and really get razor focused sharp into the needs of your target customers based on the quantification of the market segments that you want to go after because you offer the highest value in that segment with your product solution. So that's just some quick examples of how on an earlier stage, it can be a little bit more comprehensive of strategic planning, where the earlier revenue generating or later revenue generating companies, it may be a combination of a few that maybe haven't had enough attention to over the course of time, and things have changed. There's a new competitor now that's fundamentally changing the pricing dynamics that you're operating in, right? Or a new competitor that's now challenging, for lack of a better word, your current solution that's on the market. So the question is, well, okay, what can we do from an iterative perspective for this product or new product or inorganic acquisition to overcome that competitive situation in the market, right? So that's why we say all seven of these dimensions, they stay true and they continuously improve and change over time. It's up to you to keep a pulse on all of those as your business matures.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. Okay, so what do you do? What does a typical workflow look like with a company? Are you like writing reports with them, or is it just meetings, or you going out with talking to customers or regulators or something like this? Or what does a typical interaction look like?
It's a combination of all of those depending on the type of engagement. So, nowadays we work in a remote world, so there is a lot of this types of work that is done remotely. That's not to say that we don't go out in the field. And so we have engagements where it might be reviews of documents. It always includes a workshop, at least one, and usually it's several workshops. And the reason why we go for workshops is because the value isn't always in just, okay, we reviewed this and here's some feedback, right? It's like red lines on a document. It's like, yay, not too exciting. It's in the conversation and it's in the journey of really working through things because, we're not the experts in the tech, right? Or the product or the solution. Like that was born out of very smart people. And that's why they founded the company. What we're experts in is helping work through the thinking and the questions of how they can put a business around that idea, validate there is a business or is not a business around that. And so that's usually not something that starts with, send us said document, we'll review it, provide red lines and provide it back. So that's what usually we're starting off with a lot of dialogue in our conversations. We call them workshops, 90-minute workshops, and we'll do a lot of those with them to achieve some kind of an outcome. So with earlier startups, we have this 7D Medtech health check. And the whole idea is that the company will do a large, basically data dump, if you will, file drop, and we will go through all those documents in very, very tedious manner and come up with a number of observations in all seven of these dimensions, as well as recommendations. And that can be quite extensive report. We work with clients through that process. We don't just do it and then deliver the report. We bring them along the journey to understand why we're seeing what we're seeing. And that's the first deliverable. And the second deliverable then is really an activation plan. And that activation plan is scoped to a 3 to 6 month time horizon. And the reason why we do that is because we acknowledge that startups, there's always so much to do that you can't necessarily focus on everything at once. And so we really want to give them a short game plan that they can go and focus on with their team in the next 3 to 6 months and move the needle for their business and arrive at their next, as we say, at their next destination. So that's like the earlier stage. The later stage, we're absolutely in the field with them. We just had a client where we were sending people both on site and in the field with their sales reps because this particular engagement had to do with the commercialization aspect. And so part of our observation and root cause and strategic devising required us to be in the trenches, if you will, with some of the folks that were doing the actual work to provide some real strong insights.
You said you were in the trenches, so what exactly were you doing? What like yeah.
In this particular case, we had people actually meeting with customers, like physicians at hospitals. And I want to be, just kind of careful with what I disclose and share here, but the goal of these multiple site visits was a combination of seeing how the sales reps were approaching customers, approaching new clients, who they were approaching, how they were going about figuring out where to go, which hospital to go to, which clinic to go to, how do they structure their day, how do they talk about the product, and how do they position and message it, what kind of pushback do the customers provide them. And because a part of our goal in this engagement was to understand not just the dynamic of the ecosystem that they were operating in, but also the dynamic of the sales team, so that we could provide them some recommendations on how the growth could be improved through sales. And what came out of that actually is that there was some opportunities just from a core internal process perspective of how sales is being approached that could be improved. And so some really basic things too, of looking at where you're going, where you're spending your time, how you're preparing for the day, how you're preparing for the week in terms of like the number of calls you're making and how you look at that, as well as the metrics. There wasn't any real metrics around that. So you had a number of sales leaders that were, I'm not going to say running around, but were doing things very differently. And therefore you had variable outcomes as a result of that sales team. So that was one part of our contribution. The other part of the contribution was understanding how the target market was either pushing back or highlighting new needs that weren't maybe quite being fit by the product, and understanding that, what we call voice of customer, right? You've probably heard VOC before, really trying to understand that piece, because you can have the greatest sales team in the world, but if your product doesn't fit within the market, meaning fit within their workflow, fit with their needs, then you're never going to be successful no matter how cheap the product is, because price never drives behavior. And a good friend of mine at KP, I would argue the world renowned pricing reimbursement expert has taught me that, which is pricing does not dictate behavior. Value dictates behavior. And so for us, we were all about value and understanding the dynamic that was going on.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, to your point with that, like if the value isn't there and you have this cool widget or something like this, and kind of like what you were talking about before, I'm going to make it and then people will come, but that's not at all how things work. And you need to validate it, have this voice of customer be aligned with, what the product is and what the product actually needs to be. So I think that's very, very important. And it could save you, like you said, $50,000 or more of savings or something like this. Okay. And then, so this is the Neural Implant Podcast, and we talk about neurotechnology. You generally work in the medical device space, but is neurotechnology specifically, is it different in some way, or what do you see that's kind of, I guess, unique about this compared to other medtech or even other product generation or company business generation categories?
Yeah, I think that the neurosciences as a whole is really interesting. And I would argue the last, I don't know, maybe 2 years or so, for sure, at least 2 years, like it's been the real focus of a lot of different innovations. And I forget who exact said it, but a couple of years ago, Device Talks West, I think, is where it came out of. Some folks are talking about how the brain is becoming the new heart. And what they meant by that was, for the last 20, 30 years, there's been a lot of focus on cardiovascular, understanding the heart, right? I mean, you've got all kinds of different types of devices from mitral replacements to, aortic replacement valves, aortic aneurysm, like all kinds of heart cardiovascular activities. And the change that you're starting to see there in the heart space is starting to be smaller and smaller, right? It's incremental. But the brain is like this unknown abyss. And based on my learnings, I would almost argue that we know less about the neuroscience space right now as a as civilization, as humanity, than we do know. And that's not a bad thing. That's actually exciting because it means that there's no unconscious biases necessarily, or at least I hope there's not, as to how a problem should be solved. So it's really like white paper, white napkin right now. And so I'm seeing, people in the Alzheimer space a lot, Parkinson's, these types of really unfortunate neurodegenerative diseases, that there's a lot of activity of how do we solve this? How do we improve the lives of patients? And seen a lot of EEG type technology and a lot of how do you basically build those algorithms, those data algorithms between sensing, let's call it, and outcomes. And because of that, then I see a lot of folks trying to wrestle with, well, what's the business model around that, right? Because EEGs are not anything new and exciting, right? It's a little sensor. Let's just be real. But the correlation, the mathematical correlation between what you're seeing on EEGs and what that means for a Parkinson's patient or for an Alzheimer patient, that's unique, right? And but at the same time though, how many players could you have in the market that have a similar algorithm and what would be the differentiator? So that's where I think is a really interesting thought exercise of, well, is there eventually at some point going to be this consolidation of that has the data models that then could be licensed out, right? This is a business model kind of conversation. And I see some folks starting to think about that. Well, if I had a single set of hardware and, had however they're obtaining the data, would that be the most effective way to commercialize the technology? Which, it's kind of a different form, fit, and function. You think about stents in the heart, you're selling as many stents as you can to the hospitals for surgeries, where in this case, it's really like a per use. It's more like a subscription model, that you get in the mail every time from Amazon or someone about, every time they use a device or something, they're basically using the algorithm to make a clinical decision about a certain path or, outcome for a particular patient in certain therapeutic areas. So I think the brain space, neurospace is super interesting. I've been seeing a lot of folks starting to tackle that, which is exciting.
So much earlier stage, a little bit more adolescence and potential to grow potentially into something as big as the cardiac space, but still got to figure things out. Okay, so you do the consulting and you help people, and you and your team they help people, medtech companies, basically bring their ideas to market, but you also do other things. I mean, you have a newsletter, you talk about the state of the industry, and you also just got back from a big conference that you guys put together. Do you want to talk about those things as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that we believe in Nunex is that as a company, we need to constantly be providing value. And it's part of the reason why we formed the company in the beginning was to be partners to founders and leaders within the medtech industry. And so, like many people probably listening to this podcast, been on the other end of the spectrum myself. I have been, and you get salespeople constantly like, poking you with information, like, buy this, buy this, buy this. And we think that we can add the most value by highlighting interesting facts, interesting observations about moves and trends within the industry. So I'll give you one example. I was recently in Malaysia for a couple of weeks and Seoul for a few days. Every year we go back to celebrate Chinese New Year. My wife's from there, and every year I have the opportunity to go back and celebrate that fantastic time of year. While I was there, I had the opportunity to meet with some local medtech leaders. They were part of the International Trade, Association, and I learned quite a bit about how focused Malaysia is on really improving their country's focus and I would argue kind of place within the broader world ecosystem standing around healthcare. And so they're implementing, I'll say, programs within organizations and programs within their country to make healthcare more affordable, more accessible by providing nearly free health checkups on an annual basis. MRIs that we would pay several $1,000s here in the US with insurance after your copay, they're offering for next to nothing. And that surprised me because what I also learned was that Malaysia has been one of the largest chip producers. And what's on their mind now is how do they piggyback off of their experience of building an ecosystem around being a chip producer into the medtech space. And so they actually have medtech accelerators now there. They have medtech investment firms. And they've even down in Johor, which is closer south of the country, right over the border from Singapore, which I bring that up because it's interesting, is they're actually building this massive kind of focused ecosystem. And the advantages that Malaysia have from my lens is there's a level of lower regulatory burden to get into the market. There's a willingness to bring really good solutions into the market and cost effectiveness to do that because of the exchange rate makes it very palatable for a stateside company. So as I was thinking about, well, you know, I had a tech company, I had a product company solution, and I had a choice of bringing the product to the US market first for product market fitment assessment, like really that early stage stuff. What's going to be faster and more cost effective for me? I mean, I'd rather take a 18-hour flight over to Malaysia, spend 3 to 6 months there working with folks that are like really wanting new technology that's willing to do it in a cost effective way, has some of the best hospitals in the world or close to it. I mean, even Vietnam has one of the largest hospitals in the region, and not just large, but like top hospital in the region. So I think those are the types of things we think about as I travel and as the team travels, thinking about how having a medtech ecosystem hub down in Johor now, right over the border of Singapore, and Singapore has a ton of medtech related ideas and technologies being spun out of the universities and being incubated by the year over year over year of folks being relocated and building up different hubs there. They're going to be able to go right over the border for a cost effective manner and produce and iterate. That's really interesting to us, and we want to get that word out there. And so those are some of the articles you'll see on LinkedIn and other things that we send out in our newsletters of just trying to help founders and leaders think about their businesses differently. It doesn't always have to be the standard recipe for doing certain things. And yes, we were just down in Houston at the Houston MedTech Rodeo with Lifeblood, Don Lucelli, great friend of mine down there. And yeah, we put on an event to really bring together the Houston community. But when we say that, it was just based in Houston. Yes, there's a lot of Houston, folks, all kinds of universities down there doing research, and we wanted to bring them together. But we had folks from all over the world. We had folks from Israel that were there, and so it really shows you that the breadth of the medtech ecosystem goes beyond just a city. Houston in particular. And so we were really excited to be there. We had a number of panels talking about some of the strategies and some of the challenges with raising capital, some of the challenges with the IP landscape. We were up on the panels talking about strategic business planning, a lot of what we talked about this morning around the 7 core dimensions and all those pieces. And so it was really good to see all those folks come together, and we want to continue to do that and add value to the ecosystem and add value to leaders so they can start to think about their businesses differently and really eventually get their products to patients faster.
Yeah, that's pretty exciting, and it sounds like a pretty good showing. A few hundred people there, and making an impact. And then you guys will be having another one later this year too.
Yes, yeah. In October, we always try and do a little fun, so it's kind of spun out as being Oktoberfest, not in Munich this time, but be down in Houston. That's the thing, right? I mean, everyone, especially as a startup founder or early stage company, like it's a lot of stress on you. I've been there. Several startups myself. Like it's a lot, and so always got to find time to have a little fun. While you're learning and while you're developing your product. So yeah, so this one will be Oktoberfest, and we'll be launching a number of communications around that, but always trying to have a little fun while we're down there. I mean, this last one, then, we took a break. Instead of doing a panel, we substitute with wine tasting. Hey, we had a whole 45 minutes of a local winery came in and talked to us about the wine in the wine region, Houston, and then opened up a bunch of bottles and we all got to taste and talk and network. And then we went back into some panels for a while. So it's not a standard, conference where you go and sit and take notes and listen and be bored to death by the number of PowerPoint presentations. Like it's very interactive. And that's the whole idea of what we're trying to do down there.
Yeah, that's exciting. That's really cool. Yeah, that's awesome. Hopefully I'll be able to attend, and I think that sounds like a good resource for any fledgling entrepreneurs. And I like what you mentioned earlier about, doing the non-standard thing, maybe going international, and I have been to Malaysia and I really like it there. I think it does make a lot of sense for a medical device center, and Johor being right next to Singapore. I think that also makes a lot of sense. It's a nice nexus, a convergence of a lot of cultures, and so it just makes a lot more sense. So yeah, are there any, I guess, drawbacks with working internationally? I mean, I know a lot of grants and stuff like this require you to do work in the US, or if you've done work at internationally, it might be frowned upon. Have you seen anything like this, or is this still something that you haven't like implemented so much as more of an idea?
Yeah, there are a couple, I'm not going to call them drawbacks, but things that you need to be thinking about. And so the things that come to mind immediately, so let's talk about grants or funding for the moment. You're right. NIH, right, will have certain, or an SBIR, funding umbrellas will have certain criterias on how that money gets put into the company, what it gets used on, where it gets used, etc. But here's the thing I would throw out there, though. Let's take Malta as an example. Malta actually has a ton of money for companies that are interested in doing business in Malta, like $500,000 per company kind of a thing, right? So if you have to do or want to do business in Malta, for example, you have an opportunity to say, I'd like to create a subsidiary of my company and do said work in here. Great, do that. And then apply for two different types of funding opportunities. One is a non-dilutive, which I just mentioned, and another is a dilutive from the Malta government. And what I'm finding is that a lot of different countries have these types of programs. And so, yes, it's a watch out of, okay, let's say you got your phase one, NIH grant. I mean, that's fantastic. So yeah, so watch out. You probably can't take a lot of that money and go to, said country and use it. However, you can go to those countries and figure out what could you do as a company to access that capital in order to do work there. Now, so that's the first part of the question. The second part of the question I would say is, okay, specifically if you're capturing clinical data, there is a legitimate, I'm not going to say pause or concern, but you should be in tune with what would be the gaps in the data you're collecting and what the FDA is going to be looking for, assuming you're coming into to the US eventually, right? So if you're using it as like a 1-2 step, there are strategies around that, but there's also legitimate watch outs that my clinical team would be more than happy to talk about for hours and hours about that in great depth, but it is a legitimate thing. So, I mean, just the reality of it's a different population from a race perspective, just top level, right? And also geographic location as well. And so the FDA is going to at least ask questions around that, right? And it could mean that you have to do some follow on work here in the US. However, if I was CEO of said startup company, I would think that would make a lot of sense to do a bulk of work in another geography for a fraction of the cost, high quality data, and then come to the US and do just a follow-on study. I think, you know what I mean? Like even if you had to do 50 patients to follow-on study to confirm the results with US, based population to please the FDA, that's going to be a lot cheaper, faster, and more cost effective than trying to kick off a full, whatever it is, 100 patient, 200 patient trial here in the US at US cost and all the other challenges you have. And I'm seeing a lot more companies doing that have reached out to me, or just, friends in the industry that are kind of in this space, and they're Paraguay, doing clinical trials, in Panama doing clinical trials. So it's definitely not new. I just think that folks are just starting to kind of wake up that, we should be doing more of this than we have in the past. It's usually not a primary path in my experience that I've seen. It's always like a secondary path to doing those types of things. And that's where I think the mind shift, coming back to thinking about your businesses differently, that's the mind shift of, we have this. I used to use this expression when I was teaching design for Six Sigma. I used to say, why does grandma cut off the ends of the ham bone before she puts it in the oven? And it's like, I don't know. It's like she did that because her oven was smaller back in the day and it had to fit. But yet you're still cutting off the ham bone, the ends of the ham when you put it in your oven today, and it's twice the size, right? So this unconscious bias makes you naturally go and do things because that's the way we do it. And what we're trying to challenge is say, well, why? Are there other ways to do it that you can be more effective with your business to achieve your goals and move it forward?
Yeah, that's a really good way to think about things, and yeah, do the unconventional thing. I mean, it might be a little bit scary. I mean, somebody might not be willing to hop on an 18-hour flight, to go do this and set it up. But especially if you got to redo the experiments again and approve or disprove it again, but it really does make the pathway easier, I guess, the second time. I guess last question too. It's been a change of administration recently. I don't know if you noticed in the US. And yeah, so a lot of changes. And you talk to a lot of companies. What's the prognosis? What's the feeling, the change? I mean, obviously it's early days. We're recording this at end of March. So, we're still within the first 100 days, I think, of the new administration. But how are things looking from your end?
So I get this question a lot. I'm actually glad you brought it up. It gives me an opportunity maybe to share my perspective on it. You know, Here's how I look at it. The first 100 days or so has been kind of a lot of flurry. And what I mean by that is a lot of things have occurred that drive a lot of panic. And what I continue to advise people is stay calm and kind of stick with your plans to go forward. Don't be naive to some of the things that are happening, right? But the narrative that is delivered and what's actually being done, I'm constantly looking to see if the two align. And so I'll give you an example around that. There's been a lot of narrative and a lot of talk about NIH funding being cut, right? And so naturally, I first was like, oh my gosh, what about all the companies that I'm working with and that we know, friends or clients, and frankly, I kind of consider both of them the same most of the time, is what's going to happen to their funding? As I started to actually reach out to them, their funding is continuing, and most of the cuts per se are happening at the research institutes, the larger organizations with overhead expenses. And so rather than really pinpointing that and talking about these are the changes that we would like to do for said reasons, whether you agree with them or disagree, that would have maybe possibly not drawn so much panic within the market. And so that's an example of where I just keep advising folks of saying, yes, I'm aware. I have friends at the FDA. I call them. One week I called one person. That person was unemployed. The next week, he was reemployed. So what do we do? What should we do? Should we panic and freak out? Or should we say, you know what? There's a lot of chaos going on, a lot of flurry, a lot of noise. But if you just kind of drop your head down, much like if anyone scuba dives, the minute you get below about 10 to 12 feet, all of a sudden all the waves and everything just goes still. And so personally, that's where I like to be because it keeps me calm and focused on what we can really do. And while everything else is happening up top, let's just stay forward and figure this out until there's real implications. And so that's what I advise the clients and people I speak to. Doesn't mean I don't keep a pulse. Every morning I'm reading several hours on different topics, and this is one of them. Talking to various people, always wondering how it's going for them to get their insights, because what you read in the media is partially true. What I hear from people actually in the administrations or in these companies that are working through this, that's real tangible insights. And so that's again coming back to some of the things we write and some of the things we talk about, share. Like that is where this information comes from, because I feel like that is valuable, really tangible, valuable information for leaders within the medtech space.
That's a great analogy, I think, is kind of splashing on the surface, and then underneath things are a little bit more calm. They have to look like they're doing something, and the splashes are intentional actually, but yeah, like life goes on underneath the surface. And yeah, I've known some people who were let go at NIH, and I mean I haven't followed up, but I'm sure with their talent and expertise and everything like this, they'll be snatched up pretty quick. So yeah, but hopefully for the funding, I am involved in the big research institution too for the funding, but and then a lot of our looking at some grants and everything like this, and that's kind of fallen through, or a little bit delayed, or who knows, the big question mark hanging over a lot of them, but we'll see how it goes. But yeah, anyways, Nathan, this has been great. Is there anything that we didn't talk about that you wanted to mention?
I don't think so. I mean, this is great. I mean, I really enjoyed, talking to you a little bit. Hopefully, your listeners are finding this valuable, and, would just be happy to continue to talk about anything that was of interest, later with you, or anyone that's listening, if they would like to, talk a little bit more about some of the areas, happy to hop on a call with them, or put them in touch with someone that may have an answer for them. That's one of the things that we like to pride ourselves on a bit is, we don't know everything, but we can at least get the answer, or we know someone that we can connect you with that does have an answer, or can help you. And that's one of the powerful things about our network, that we always open the doors to and our friends.
Yeah, excellent. And it seems you're on Nunex, there's a contact or let's talk, button. So I think people can go through there and be able to contact you directly. So thank you so much, Nathan. This has been excellent.
Appreciate it.
Hope you enjoyed the show and were able to learn something new, bringing together different fields in novel ways. Until next time on the Neural Implant Podcast.